Hello and welcome back to the Surfer's Library, proudly presented by Hillsborough Surf Club. I'm Billy Jack, your guide through the pages of surf history, culture, and legends. Aloha. Today's episode marks our return to our short story format for the rest of this season. I've pulled from the Surfer Library bookshelf author Chris Ahrens' book, Joyrides, Surf Stories Volume 2. I've selected 3 out of the many great stories to share with you today. The Relic, King of the Rendezvous Ballroom, and The Preacher. I really love this book, and I'm also very thankful that Chris is letting me share this with you. This book, as well as his others, are available at his website, paralandrapublishingcompany.com and amazon.com. Also, if you want to help support the podcast, you can do so by visiting buymeacoffee.com/The Surfer's Library to do so. It helps cover the cost of the podcasting platform fees needed to get the podcast out each month, so any little bit helps. Let's paddle out. The Relic. To anyone with at least average vision, Stanley Cassidy would have looked like a typical mid-60s surfer from Southern California, where he attended high school in the last green acre of Los Angeles County, Palos Verdes Estates, along with some of America's most privileged teens. In subsequent class reunions that he never attended, nobody would ever recall anything unusual about him, if they recalled him at all. His English teachers summed him up as a tall, lanky, quiet boy with sandy blonde hair who disappeared each day immediately after school, presumably to surf. At school, he had blended in with everyone else in his faded jeans, t-shirt, army jacket, and worn-out Converse tennis shoes, common dress for surfers of the time. The one big difference between Stanley and his classmates, however, was that he was not trying to be fashionable in his clothing. He was wearing the only rags he could afford and hoping that nobody would guess the secret he never shared, that he had been born into the original sin of poverty. Ever since his mother's death 4 years earlier, he and his father had been on a pilgrimage of the best gourmet dumpsters filled with moldy brie, rotting caviar, and blemished fruit. Home was a dying VW van shared with his alcoholic and violent father until the day the old man punched him in the head and threw him and his worthless surfboard out into the street. Sadness gave way to anger, gave way to relief, gave way to joy, gave way to freedom. He was now free to hang out on the beach all day, free to surf, free to starve. After finding shelter in a beach cave for 3 days and nights, eating tiny abalone from the tide pools at the cove, and raiding fruit trees from the immaculately groomed Doberman-infested yards where perfect food fell from heaven, Stanley had had enough. He hitched to San Diego. When the cops threatened to run him in or send him home, he found his way in the trunk of a car across the border into Mexico. In Tijuana, he caught a ride with some rough-looking Mexican-American men headed down the Baja coast. They tied the old board into the trunk and were gone, chugging tequila from the bottle, nodding off, and eventually turning the wheel over to the boy, asking him to keep alert for the federales, who would be quick to send them all to prison for the illegal case of M1 rifles that they were transporting to the southern Baja town of La Paz. Having only driven a car twice before, Stanley was petrified, sweating, knuckles down, weaving through the thin roads of the steep hills, passing the famished cows and the crosses which served as homemade grave markers for the many who had lost their lives on this route. The road eventually dropped back onto the coast, somewhere north of Ensenada. It was dark when the men ordered him to pull over at the gas station and fill up the tank. The light-footed Gremmy waited until nobody was looking, yanked his board from the trunk, and ran and hid behind some cactus. The men searched for him for a little while. Being desperate and drunk, however, they were soon down the road, the evil sedan limping off half-lit into the cool desert night. For the boy, the night was spent hungry, scared, and alone amid the cactus and beer cans that composed the side of the road. The next day brought a ride from a cattle truck driver who fed the kid cold chicken and warm Pepsi, and dropped him off a few hundred miles down the track in a fish camp where the women fussed over him, petted his blonde hair, giggled to themselves, and made the skinny boy his first hot meal in weeks. The men ignored him, thinking that he looked too soft for any good work. After a few days watching him do nothing but sit and eat with the women, Juan Gomez, one of the oldest men in the village, approached him. Having lived for a time in Los Angeles, California, the man's English was good. So you are here now, and the women take care of you. Maybe you would like to become a woman yourself, he said. When the young boy did not react, Gomez continued. All of the men say that you squat when you piss. Maybe you will do woman things for food, or maybe there is something else that you will do, said Gomez, sitting near the boy, the tassel from his old straw hat swaying as he nodded. Gomez gave the boy a beer to drink, and he took a beer for himself. Recalling his hatred for his father's alcoholism, the boy left the beer alone. Looking to the ocean, he said to the man, I'm going to make surfboards. The old man laughed and slapped Stanley on the shoulder, believing that the boy had told a good joke. No, really, we do not need toys for grown men here. We need workers. Everyone must work. What will you do, Guero? The boy turned away from the old man's steady gaze and said, I will do what I want to do, old man. Now leave me alone. Juan Gomez laughed and put his old but powerful hand on the boy's shoulder, squeezing it to let him know just how strong he was. The boy turned to the old man in fear that he would hit him as his father had done after such talk. Now he was ready to listen. Old? Said Juan, laughing at first. Old is nothing. You cannot show me old. Old is like poor, only better. Old is like short, and nobody ever knows that they are short unless they stand up against someone who is tall. Yes, I am old. Damn you to hell, Guero. But I live as if I am young. Much more young than you. If you tell me that I am old again, I will be forced to kick you in the balls. So shut up and drink your beer, and then go surfing and find out what work you will do. And no more talking about old. The old man released Stanley from his grip, and the boy walked over to the cliff where he had stashed his surfboard. He broke the beer on the rocks and watched the waves taper and wrap into a rock-strewn bay. The surf was pretty good. Nobody was out. In time, Stanley began to know the point. He often paddled out beneath the eyes of the fishermen who, by the time he awoke, were coming in from a day's work. They watched and said nothing as Stanley caught a wave and turned and ran to the nose and trimmed against the fast wall. He was not the best surfer in the world, but plenty good enough to impress the isolated villagers who once lined the cliffs to watch him ride the point waves that had never before been sliced open by fiberglass and foam. From the water, Stanley watched the fishermen pull their old pangas up onto the rocks of the shore and unload their catch. As the men labored, Stanley saw something in them that he had not seen before. They were happy in hard work. He considered the words of the old man. Everyone must work. Juan had been right to laugh at the idea of making surfboards for the people. Nobody here surfed. In that one moment, the boy decided on his career. He would be a fisherman. By evening, the villagers had left the cliffs, returning with wives, sons, daughters, aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, and everyone in the village, and even some from surrounding villages. Some came with cooked fish, some with handmade tortillas and pots of rice and beans. Some were holding colorful piñatas, standing to watch the surfer walk over the water until the darkness fell and the food was spread out on a wooden table next to cases of soda, beer, and tequila. Some of the men played guitars and accordions. Those who could not play sang. Everybody danced, and the fiesta, which Stanley never realized was in honor of his unplanned arrival, lasted well into the morning hours. The next day, the dedicated fishermen were the first to roll out of their bunks into the ocean, hungover, working the familiar reefs and kelp beds until midday when they returned home, rowing boats that sat low because of the fish and the one big shark, white teeth gleaming, bloody and now rendered harmless in the bottom of the boat. Stanley surfed and ate and made friends with the fishermen and their daughters. His eye was caught by one girl in particular. Lupita was a lovely, bright-faced girl whom he paddled out to the friendly waves that peeled over the eelgrass on the inside reef. Both Stanley and Lupita were laughing, and she hung on to him tightly until she lay on the board alone, awaiting the push from him that sent her flying towards the shore, surfing and happy. Stanley eventually became a fisherman, continuing to surf when he could, driving north to California occasionally in order to buy surfboard materials, returning home to make rough surfboards in a wooden shack for himself and Lupita and a few of his new friends. He taught some of the men to surf as they had taught him to fish. Before his 18th birthday, Stanley was wed to Lupita at the ancient stone church in the middle of the village. The ceremony was followed by the biggest fiesta that anyone could remember. Since the priest was out of town, Juan Gomez put on his best suit and performed the ceremony. He cried and made everyone else cry as he told the story of the brave boy and the beautiful girl. Afterwards, Juan drank too much tequila and ended up, late at night, dancing alone over the dirt and then staggering up onto the main road where he hitched into Ensenada and got into a fight at Husong's Cantina. When he could not find a car to borrow for his return, he took a tomato truck and drove it recklessly through his village, knocking down many of the little wooden structures until he was halted by a narrow ditch. Since the ditch was the only thing between the charging truck and the steep cliff, nobody ever filled it in. They have a Spanish name for it, which translates into something like the hole of the truck. It is considered an almost holy place. The Federales came to the village with the truck's owner, and everyone in the village helped to pull the vehicle from the ditch. Juan was taken away without resisting in a Federale car. It took 200 of the villagers' hard-earned dollars to bail the old man out, but it was worth it to hear the story of the night when Gomez punched a man at Husong's Cantina for swearing in front of one of the local girls. There was no real honeymoon for the newlyweds, but everyone was happy to see that they did not come out of the little stick and tar paper house until 3 days after the wedding. More than 30 good years have passed since the bewildered and frightened Gremy first rolled into the fishing village with his surfboard. You wouldn't recognize him or the village any longer. A paved road leads naive tourists right to the beach, where they pay too much for the lobster that are now imported from Maine. There are several markets in town, and 2 new hotels are being completed with plans for more development. You wouldn't recognize the Gremy either. When he is wearing his hat to hide his blonde hair, nobody can tell that he was not born there. He now has the dark leather skin and all-seeing eyes of a Baja fisherman, and the hard muscles of a lifelong surfer. The children follow him around and touch his blonde hair and ask him to make surfboards for them, something that he does for free whenever he finds the time. If you visit the points of Baja, show respect to the locals. Violators will be prosecuted, persecuted, poked, pummeled, and possibly jailed. Anyone who acts like they own the place is guaranteed a miserable time. Friends, on the other hand, may be taken home to drink Tecate cerveza and eat lobster until they burst. Little remains of old Baja anymore, but in one small town is a ditch that nobody will fill in, and a shack that will never be torn down in our lifetime. Here, a keen observer will spot an unlikely sight: a yellowed, delaminated, and retired Jacobs surfboard in the mid-9-foot range. The children are grown, and they sometimes bring the grandchildren by the hand to see the old surfboard, to touch it, treating it like a sacred relic, telling stories of the gringo who first wandered into their village and walked on the water a long time ago. King of the Rendezvous Ballroom. It was just a big concrete building without much character, but the Rendezvous Ballroom on Balboa Island was about the best place in the world to be young in 1963. We were young, 14 years old, and ready for life beyond the smog-choked reality of Los Angeles. Our joy peaked once a week at the Rendezvous, the place where Dick Dale and the Deltones first blasted out Miserlou as we stomped, salt drying on our skin, sinuses dripping from extended surf sessions at the Huntington Pier. Surfing was the fad, and scores of hodads and phonies with peroxided hair, skateboards, and sometimes even surfboards, which they used as props on top of their cars, lived in our neighborhood. The hodads and phonies are forgotten to me now, but the one true surfer was named Dave McMurray. He was a buck-toothed kid we called Gopher. Neither Gopher nor I were great surfers, but we made sure that we got to the beach whenever and however we could. My dad, who had been a Santa Monica surfer in the 1930s, understood the call of the sea and took us surfing regularly. As we got older, however, we didn't want to be seen with him, and so we made up stories to fool him, then hitched to Huntington Beach, and stayed with an elderly widow who rented us floor space in her attic for 50 cents a night. To some, Huntington might have looked ugly, but to me it was beautiful. The old market on Main Street that sold baked potatoes, the greasy splendor of the Buzz Inn, and the Golden Bear where Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin would later play. The Pavilion, a club at the foot of the pier, regularly hosted Little Stevie Wonder. For a dime you could hear the winos tell of the glory days when oil was king. I remember a freewheeling ghetto on the edge of powerful surf. We spent our days borrowing surfboards to ride, body surfing, panhandling change on the pier, hustling girls, and trying to find rides to the Rendezvous. Everybody went to the Rendezvous on Saturday nights. I did all right for myself with the girls there, and so did all my friends. Still, it was Gopher who could charm any girl he met. He wasn't like the rest of us. He didn't go in for World War II clothing. He dressed immaculately, white, long-sleeve arrow shirts with long button-down collars, pressed cuff pants, polished wingtips, hair parted to the side just above the collar. He carried his Benson and Hedges cigarettes in a silver case and would light them from a silver Zippo lighter. At home, in school, or at the beach, he was nothing. But once he stepped onto the dance floor, he became royalty, never sweating or swearing in the company of girls, and putting on a convincing act of wealth and refinement. I never really did figure out how he did it. He wasn't good looking. He had a bent nose, a chipped tooth, and a scar on his forehead from a foul ball that had bonked him while watching a baseball game. He told everyone that he received the scar when shooting the Huntington Pier on a big south swell. He had that special knack of making you want to believe him, and you could love him without ever being jealous of him. We all loved him, but none so much as the mass of girls dropped from the large end of the LA fun funnel from Lakewood, Norwalk, Pasadena, Tustin, Santa Ana, and Whittier. To them, the rendezvous was a church and Gopher was a god, or a surfer, which at that time was about the same thing. When Gopher couldn't stand it anymore, he would lure his date into the parking lot. She would follow him out to the car, which should have presented a problem since he was 2 years from driving. He always chose the best unlocked car in the lot. Usually it was a lowered candy apple red Woody with reverse chrome rims, baby moons, white tuck and roll that belonged to a Pasadena surfer called Big D. Standing about 6'4" and weighing over 250 pounds, D was about the biggest surfer you ever saw. He didn't need to lock his car because nobody dared mess with it. Nobody but Gopher, who in a testosterone-loaded trance would quietly open the door, slide his girl onto the mattress, and continue where he'd left off in the ballroom. Every Saturday night, Gopher had a new girl on the mattress of the car. Only once did he get caught. Then he learned about the power of Big D. The man had spent time hardening his muscles in Quentin after an armed robbery went bad. He angrily tore the unbuttoned Gopher from the girl's embrace. The girl screamed, then pounded her little fists into the massive intruder who had just barged in on Gopher's good time. Gopher was dragged out of the Woody and pressed up against its white oak panels. That's when our boy did what he did best, talking. The girl had fainted on the dance floor, and he was checking her heartbeat, trying to revive her, he said. It was a sap story, but like most thugs, D had a small brain and a soft heart. D was so moved that he took Gopher and the girl, who played along, to the emergency room. She came around nicely in the waiting room before the doctor could see her. Privately, Gopher told the girl that D was his crazy uncle and that he was loaning the car to him. After the hospital incident, we became friends with Big D. He would regularly swoop down from Pasadena into Montebello to take us surfing at Rincon, or to Swami's, where he would throw his 10-foot 6-inch red-paneled Greg Knoll gun from the top of the cliff. He was a terrible surfer, but he never backed down, and nobody ever dared take off in front of him. When the new surf movie came to the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium, D piled us all into the Woody with him. Inside the auditorium, we saw every hot stick on the coast. Carson, Aberg, Weber, Knoll, all there for the premiere. Grammys made 2 bagger slides down the aisles and turned the movie posters into paper gliders. A beach ball was being smacked back and forth until D wrestled it away from a trembling Grammy's hands, popped the thing with his teeth, and threw the wreckage to the ground. Everyone went quiet for a moment. Some Grammy ran onto the stage and hung a BA. He was cheered on until the place went black and everyone shouted him down. The opening shots of the film showed big crowded waves at Rincon. A surfer in a colored wetsuit, something very unusual for the times, took off from the peak. Colored wetsuit had ridden quite a ways when someone on a red surfboard wheeled around and took off in front of him. The guy on the red board bounced prone down the face. Close focus showed that it was D. We couldn't believe it. After somehow making the drop on the overhead wave, he lumbered to his feet, waited until colored wetsuit closed in, and then reached back and straight-armed him. This sent colored wetsuit and his board to the beach. Big D and his board followed as the remainder of the wave went unridden. We hooted our lungs out as D slumped low, shyly in his seat, and laughed quietly to himself. A few weeks passed, and we were back home again with nothing to do. That's when we heard that D was in town to find the hodads who had beat up Eddie, a surfer friend of ours. As the story goes, D backed down the entire hodad gang by throwing a Molotov cocktail into their midst, scattering them as they ran for cover. D won the battle, but the state won the war. He was sent back to Quentin, and we never saw him again. Hanging around with Big D had made us feel invincible. It also made us some enemies. He never liked Hodads, and would take it upon himself to kick them out whenever he spotted their greasy hair or Sir Guy shirts at the rendezvous. A Hodad once made the mistake of shoving D. We were terrified at what would happen, but D surprised us by simply walking away. He went quietly outside, found the Hodad's car, caved in the roof, and filled it with all the cheap wine he could find. He then stripped down to his boxers and sat in the wine-filled bathtub, drinking from an open bottle of wine until the Hodad himself came out. When he saw the Hodad, D jumped from the car's roof like a 600-pound gorilla, down onto the hood, jumping up and down until it too was smashed. The Hodad was so scared he merely shook D's hand and drove the rumpled car away, glad to be alive. With our protector gone, the Hodad with the ruined car and some of his friends came looking for us. We were on our own again, hitching to Huntington on the weekends and finding our way to the rendezvous in the evenings. The opening band, whose name I've forgotten, was playing when trouble broke out between surfers and Hodads. Gopher tore himself away from his girl, walked up to the stage, grabbed the singer's microphone and yelled the word, "Hodads!" The band stopped playing and everybody in the ballroom looked up to see Gopher, standing on the center stage. He diverted our attention to the two big Lakewood Hodads, both with long, greasy hair, wrestling around on the floor, getting the best of 3 Grammys. I recognized one of the fighters as the Hodad whose car had been ruined by Big D. "You!" screamed Gopher, pointing to the Hodad. "You!" The fighters let go of the Grammys and looked up. They were sweaty, breathing hard, and glaring at Gopher, no doubt recognizing him as part of D's crew. Gopher puffed out his tiny chest and tried to back them down in the way that Big D would have done, if only he were there. "Hodads, hang!" shouted Gopher into the microphone. The fighters now turned their anger to Gopher. Realizing the crowd's support, Gopher became braver. He pointed at the Hodads and shouted again, "Hodads, go home!" The Hodads froze as the crowd's disapproval increased. Realizing that Big D was gone and that nobody else could hurt them, they moved forward and elbowed and kicked their way toward the stage, ready to pounce on Gopher, who stood his ground in center stage. "Hodads, go home!" he screamed again into the microphone, backing up as the angry Hodads came closer. As he slowly retreated, Gopher again shouted, "No Hodads!" "No Hodads!" repeated the lead singer of the band, who had come forward to claim his rightful spot on the microphone. Gopher wrestled the microphone away from the singer again and pushed him back as the fighters aggressively made their way to the stage. "No Hodads!" Gopher shouted once again. The Hodads, who were much older and bigger than most of the surfers in the crowd, began climbing onto the stage with no resistance from anyone until someone pulled one of them back down, undid his belt, and pulled down his pants. There was an outburst of laughter as again Gopher led the cry, "No Hodads! No Hodads! No Hodads!" The Hodad in his boxers was too busy trying to cover himself up to be a threat any longer. Soon everyone was stomping their feet and chanting, "No Hodads! No Hodads! No Hodads!" The one Hodad remained in his underwear. A girl snapped his waistband. He was pushed from the ballroom out onto the street. Then we threw his friend out. Secure with the crowd behind him, Gopher stood in the doorway and ordered the Hodads to stay out. After the Hodads left, Gopher returned to center stage, reintroduced the band, and attempted to sing along with them until the lead singer gently nudged him off the platform. The band exploded with fast music and we all danced hard. Then came a slow song, and we floated over the floor dreamily in pairs, clearing a spot for the honorary Gopher and his girl, who were dancing cheek to cheek gracefully. It was his night, and for that one moment he was the king of the rendezvous ballroom, something that made him the king of the world as far as we were concerned. The rendezvous ballroom was burned down, perhaps by an arsonist with no pants, in the mid-60s. It was never rebuilt. The Preacher. We weren't bad kids, really. Just parentally funded rebels, smoking cigarettes found in the gutter or purchased with our allowance, flipping off strangers and causing as many minor problems as senior citizens and children would let us get away with. That's how we acted in our hometown. When we were away from home, we were a lot worse. At first, we would try to imitate our local friend Ted, one of the ruling young surfers of Huntington Beach, who destroyed the waves and anyone who got within earshot with his caustic wit. Finding it difficult to copy Ted's surfing or his personality, Gopher, Denny, and I attracted attention by messing with those who couldn't defend themselves. One of Gopher's favorite scams was to wait for a particularly cute girl to walk to the water. He'd dig a hole in the sand, cover it with her towel, and lay beneath the towel until she returned and fell down upon him. Once the screaming and shock ended, Gopher had a date for the night. We had fun with that until we got bored. Then someone would do something stupid like steal a wallet or start a fight with some poor old fisherman whose line was cast too close to a surfer. Our favorite pastime other than surfing was to hassle the preacher, a friendly, gray-haired old man who could always be found beneath the pier, patiently offering the gospel to anyone who wanted it. I would kneel behind the preacher while Gopher walked by and bumped him, something that would send him tumbling to the sand. Everyone laughed as the old man dusted himself off and slowly pulled himself to his feet again. Once I lit the preacher's pants on fire. Worse, I threw one of the little red Bibles he had given me back into his face. It was all fun until we got home. Then I'd call Gopher, worried that we were going to burn in hell for what we had done. But peer acceptance was stronger even than the thought of eternal fire, and the next weekend we would play tricks on the preacher again. His only retort to our cruelty was a kind smile and the words, "I'm praying for you, boys." Once, after trying to humiliate the preacher, an older guy pushed me down into the sand. "You think it's funny picking on an old man? Well, pick on me," he said, knocking me down again after I tried to stand up. If nobody had been around, I would have apologized. Since everybody was watching, I told him to go to hell. I didn't even see it coming. I didn't see it, but I felt it. His clenched fist connecting with my jawbone. I hit the sand, flat and hard, and lay there wanting to cry, too afraid to move. The guy came at me and would have hit me again, except that the preacher had a hand on him, asking him not to hurt me. The big guy let me go and the preacher lifted me up, dusted me off, and asked if I was okay. I didn't say a word to him. Years rolled by, and I quit going to Huntington, but I never quit thinking about the preacher. As I grew up, I realized that he was about the bravest man I had ever known, coming down to the pier each day where his only pay was ridicule, his only reward, a heavenly one. As I found faith of my own, I thought about the preacher all the time. Usually this left me feeling guilty. One day in my early 20s, I drove to the pier to find him. There he was, dark clothes, straw hat, big smile, looking much as he did when I had left him, only older. He spoke with a shake in his kind voice to a new group of kids who were hassling him in much the same way that I had done. I wanted to pound them like I had been pounded. When I caught the peaceful look in the man's eye, I realized that he didn't need any help from me. When the kids left after baptizing him with their half-eaten hamburgers, ketchup, Cokes, and French fries, I found the courage to approach him. "Do you remember me? I lit your pants on fire once," I said, looking down to see that the cuffs of his pants had recently been burned again. I hung my head until he lifted it with his hard, wrinkled hands and our eyes met. He said nothing, but I could see forgiveness in him. He nodded as he looked into my tearful eyes. Motioning to the sky, he said, "I'll see you up there, brother." That was all he said to me. After shaking hands, I walked away. I never did see him again, but one day I heard later that the preacher from Huntington Beach had died, alone and penniless, in a cheap room on Main Street. They say that he had his hand on his Bible, and that he wore a contented smile. Well, thank you once again for joining us. I really hope you enjoyed today's surf stories. Until next time, keep your toes on the nose, your bottom turns tight, and your stoke high. I'll see you in the lineup. Chris Ahrens is a prolific surf writer, storyteller, and ocean historian based in Southern California. He's been writing for surfing magazines for over 30 years, contributing to every major surfing publication in the world. Among his books are Good Things Love Water, Joyrides, Surf Stories, Volume 2, and Kalea's Gift, Surf Stories, all of which collect his essays, retold legends, and experiences from decades of surfing. His most recent book is Wind and Sea, Life, Death, Resurrection, a 155-page tome chronicling the history, culture, and characters of the Wind and Sea reef break in La Jolla from the 1930s through the 1980s. Ahrens also has experience beyond print. He was editor-in-chief of Risen magazine for 7 years, wrote and directed the documentary Dope, Death of Prison Eventually, and has co-written the memoirs of skateboarder Christian Hosoi. He lives in Cardiff by the Sea, California with his wife Tracy and their cats. Surfing in the ocean remains central to his life. To learn more, visit his website, paralandrapublishingcompany.com.